You know, think about the last time you clicked "I agree" on something online. Or maybe even just a simple promise you made to a friend. You probably thought, yep, that's a deal. But what if the law doesn't actually see it that way? Well, today we're going to uncover some of the hidden legal tripwires that decide when a deal is really not a deal at all.
We hear this phrase all the time, right? It's one of those foundational ideas of justice, a simple, powerful truth that makes us feel like the law applies to everyone in exactly the same way.
But here's the thing. When you get into the world of contract law, that simple truth gets complicated, and it gets complicated fast. Because before a deal can even exist, the law has to answer a much more basic question. Does it even see you as a person who's capable of making a deal in the first place?
And that brings us right to our first major hurdle, this whole idea of the legal person. Before you can even get to a contract, the law has to recognize you, or whatever it is, as a person.
So what on earth is a legal person? Well, it's any entity, and I mean any entity, that the law decides to give rights and obligations to. This is not just about being human. It's a special legal status that decides who can own stuff, who can sue someone, and who can be locked into a contract.
And the list of what the law considers a person is honestly full of surprises. Yeah, human beings are on there, usually, but so are giant corporations, and even ships. In some places, religious idols have this status. And this leads to some pretty wild modern questions, right? Like, can a parrot who keeps ordering snacks from an Alexa be part of a contract? And what in the world are we going to do about artificial intelligence?
And look, this isn't science fiction anymore. AI art generators are making absolutely stunning original work. So who's the artist? The person who coded it or the AI itself? And if it's the AI, should it have the legal personhood to own the copyright to its own art? Technology is really forcing the law to ask some seriously deep questions about what it even means to be a person.
Okay, so let's just assume for a second that the law recognizes you as a person. The next question is, do you have the capacity to make a binding agreement? And let's start with a group we all know, minors, or basically anyone under the age of 18.
The law gives young people this really powerful kind of protection. See, most contracts they sign are something called voidable. You can think of it like a one-way escape hatch. The minor can choose to cancel the deal whenever they want, but the adult on the other side, they're stuck. But this protection isn't absolute. There are two huge exceptions: contracts for necessaries and contracts for beneficial employment.
So what actually counts as a necessary today? I mean, is a video game a necessary? This exact question went to court in a case involving Grand Theft Auto V. The game publisher argued that their license agreement was a contract for a necessary, but the court said, nope. They ruled that while a game might feel super necessary to a teenager, legally speaking, it's a service, not an essential good, so the contract wasn't binding.
And that second exception, beneficial employment, is shown perfectly in the case of the soccer star Wayne Rooney. When he was just 15, a court looked at two of his contracts. His playing contract with his club, that was binding. It was his job, after all. But a totally separate contract he had with his agent, the court said no, that's voidable. Why? Because it wasn't essential for him to earn a living. And that little distinction is everything.
So, while the law is pretty generous with protections for minors, it takes a very, very different approach for adults who might lack mental capacity. Here, the bar for getting out of a contract is set much, much higher.
To void a contract because of mental incapacity, you have to pass this really tough two-part test that's been around since 1892. First, you have to prove you were actually incapable of understanding the deal when you made it. But that's not enough. You also have to prove that the other person knew you were incapable. And proving both of those things, that is an incredibly high bar to clear. And yeah, the courts have drawn a very sharp line here. This quote from a famous case makes it crystal clear. Not being able to read the contract or not understanding the language is just not the same as legal incapacity. The court's logic is that a person who can't read knows they can't read. They're aware of their limitation. But someone with a mental incapacity might not even be aware that they don't understand what's happening.
So when you put them side by side, the contrast is pretty stark, isn't it? For minors, the law's default position is protection. The contract is basically assumed to be voidable. But for those with a mental incapacity, the default is the opposite. The contract is valid. The entire burden of proof gets flipped onto the more vulnerable person to try and beat that really tough two-part test. It just shows a totally different approach in the law.
But okay, even if you have full legal capacity, does that automatically mean you have real freedom of contract? You know, the law might say you can make a deal, but all sorts of real-world barriers can make that freedom more of a theory than a reality.
I mean, for millions of people, this idea of freedom of contract is kind of a myth. If you can't get a bank account, you're basically shut out of the whole digital economy. If you can't possibly understand the dense legal language and the terms and conditions, did you really consent to them? And then there's the growing digital divide, which means tons of people are just left behind, unable to access the same deals the rest of us take for granted.
But some people are trying to close this gap with some really innovative solutions. Down in South Africa, a lawyer named Robert de Roy developed employment contracts made entirely of pictures for fruit harvesters who couldn't read. It's just a powerful attempt to make consent meaningful and to make sure that understanding your own rights is accessible to absolutely everyone. All right, so we've talked about who can make a contract and whether they have the capacity to do it. But there's one final, really fundamental piece of the puzzle. Did you actually intend for your agreement to be a legally binding pact, or was it, just a casual promise?
So, the law starts with these two powerful default settings depending on the situation. If you make a deal with family or friends, the law just assumes you don't intend to be legally bound. But in a business setting, it assumes you absolutely do. Now, these are just starting points. You can always prove that the opposite was true if you have the right evidence.
And there's really no better story to explain this than the incredible case of the lottery winners. So, an employee, Mr. Oscan, had a dream that he and his boss were going to win the lottery. So they agreed to play together using phrases like 50-50, they both chipped in money, bought some tickets, and unbelievably, Oscam's dream actually came true. They won £1 million.
So, naturally, when the boss tried to keep the whole prize, the case went to court. Now, because this was an agreement between colleagues, the starting assumption was that it wasn't legally binding. But the court looked at the evidence, and the judge found that their specific agreement to play 50-50 was strong enough to completely flip that assumption and prove they really did intend to create a contract.
The court was totally satisfied they had intended to create a real, binding legal agreement. A simple conversation, a dream, and an agreement to go half and half ended with a court ordering that £1 million prize to be split right down the middle.
So the next time you make a deal, you'll see it a little differently. It's not just about a simple promise, it's this complex legal event that all hangs on three big questions. Does the law even recognize the parties as persons? Do they have the capacity to agree? And did they actually mean for their promise to be legally real? Which leaves us with this fascinating question for the future, right? As our smart speakers, our cars, and all these other AIs start making more and more agreements for us automatically, who is the legal person in those contracts? Who is actually making the deal? Well, that's something the law, and all of us, are going to have to figure out.